I've often wondered, how did the disciples know what Jesus prayed in his great prayer of John 17 in Gethsemane when they were all asleep? Well, the answer is he didn't pray that prayer in Gethsemane. Look at verse 1. It was only when Jesus had finished praying that he left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley where there was a garden. He prayed that prayer in the upper room. It was, if you like, a benediction at the Last Supper. What was it like to have a great prayer like that prayed over you? And only when he'd finished praying did they leave the upper room and go to Gethsemane. I put that on Google Maps. It's a very short walk. You can do it in half an hour. Now, the interesting thing is that John never uses the word Gethsemane, and that led me to a search, and I came up with this chart of the things that only John said and the things that were said in all four of the Gospels, and it's quite instructive. So we're going to use that as a basis for the rest of this talk. The most important thing only John says about Gethsemane is that when they came saying we're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, he said, I am he, and they all drew back and fell to the ground. Why did they fall to the ground? Because he'd used the great I am, the name of God. They'd entered the presence of God and heard him say his name and were lucky to come out alive. That I am is a great theme in the Gospel of John. Now, I've read this verse often, but it only really came home to me when I saw it at Oberammergau on that great stone stage, very dramatic. When Jesus said, I am, they all stumbled back and fell down as though dead. They were lucky they weren't. And their torches rolled across the stage, flaming. One of them even nearly fell into the audience, and yet not one of those torches touched against anyone else. And then it dawned on me. Jesus waited patiently while they slowly recovered, picked up their helmets and their swords and their flaming torches, and then arrested him. He could have walked off into the darkness and they'd never have caught him. He could have called 10,000 angels, but he died alone for you and me. And then in verse 12, only John tells us that they took him first to Annas, the father-in-law of the high priest Caiaphas. Now, only John even mentions Annas, and he calls him the high priest, yet Caiaphas is the high priest. What's going on here? Well, here's a list of all the high priests from the time of Jesus' bar mitzvah to the time of his crucifixion. You'll see that there are 5 of them. In the middle, there are 4 in the space of 3 years. What happened? Did a whole lot of them die? No. The issue is that the Roman governor appointed the high priest, because the high priest wasn't just a religious position, he was de facto the prime minister under the Roman governor. Now, Annas was actually the last high priest appointed by the Jews, so there were many who saw him as the true high priest. It was a sign of the ferment and unrest in Judea at the time. Here's a list of the governors at the time of Christ. Marcus Ambivalus, Annas Rufus, Valerius Gratus. Now, I don't know about you, those names really tickle my funny bone. The first one, I think, must have been hard to get a decision out of. And the names remind me of the Asterix cartoons, where he had wonderful names for the Romans. They all ended in US. Names like Christmas Bonus tickled my fancy. And my favorite of all, Dinosaurus, do you think he saw us? And so there were these 3 governors, but there was a 4th one that we don't ever make a joke about. His name also ended in US. Pontius Pilatus. But that one, Valerius Gratus, he made 4 appointments of high priest in 3 years. Why? Because he couldn't find one that really suited him. He wanted someone who would be nice and compliant and obedient to the Roman Empire. And he found him in Caiaphas. Caiaphas was one of those people who wants peace at any price. How do I know that? Because it was Caiaphas, only John tells us, who was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good for one man to die for all the people. What he was saying is, Jesus is dispensable. He is causing trouble. Let's keep the peace at any price. And the price was the life of Jesus. He was dispensable. Caiaphas was very concerned about the unrest in Israel at the time. So was Pilate. He was working from the same basis. Peace at any price. Let me protect my position. And they had good reason to be anxious, because there was great unrest fermenting. 45 years later, it would boil over into a war against Rome with disastrous consequences for Judea. Now we come to the trial of Jesus, and we get the feeling the whole way through this chapter that John was an eyewitness to these events in ways that the other gospel writers just weren't. And the reason for that is given in verse 16. He says, the other disciple, that's John, was known to the high priest. He knew the prime minister, and that gave him access to the palaces of power. So he tells us a lot of things the others don't tell us. He tells us that Peter began in the outer court, and it was only through John's influence that he was brought into the inner court, where he could see Jesus, although from a distance. Only John tells us that the third person who asked Peter if he was a disciple was a relative of the one whose ear had been cut off, and only John tells us that that man's name was Malchus. But John was close to the proceedings and could hear what was going on. Only John tells us that Jesus asked Annas, "Why do you question me? I did everything in public. Ask those who heard me, they will tell you." What Jesus is doing is he's asking for a fair trial. He's saying, let's get to the truth here. John is very preoccupied with the subject of truth. But this is an illegal trial. It was illegal to hold a trial at night time because witnesses couldn't come forward. And only John tells us that at that question, an official of the high priest struck Jesus across the face. Have you ever seen someone slapped across the face in real anger? I saw it once. It made me sick to my stomach and I couldn't sleep that night. This is the first time the Son of God was struck, and it won't be the last. And then we move on to the palace of Pilate, and only John tells us that the people wouldn't go to the inner court because that would make them ceremonially unclean. How hypocritical is that? They are so concerned with all their petty laws about clean and unclean, and there were hundreds of those laws, and yet they're involved in this very dirty business. And only John hears them say, "We have no right to execute anyone." That was a straight lie. 3 years later, they executed Stephen by stoning him, and the Romans didn't turn a hair. The issue here is that they did not want to be seen to be responsible for death. They wanted Pilate to be seen to be responsible. And Pilate wouldn't be responsible, so he washed his hands. A lot of hand washing went on that night. And then only John tells us that Jesus before Pilate said, "My kingdom is not of this world." John has been showing that throughout his gospel. Time and again he shows that Jesus is answerable only to his Father. He said that, I counted, 115 times in different ways in his gospel. And then only John tells us of Pilate's epic question, what is truth? What indeed? John is very preoccupied with the question of truth. He believes that truth sets free and untruth binds. That it matters very much what you believe. It's a matter of life and death. And the world is in serious trouble at the moment. Truth, even sheer facts, are under question. And we need to be careful that we don't be part of that in any way. I'm quite concerned about how very intelligent people are passing on WhatsApps that at one glance you can tell are not true, or at least are very slanted. There's a kind of hysterical tone to them, and we need to be sure to protect truth. And so John tells us all of these things that enrich our knowledge of this story. But then there are a number of things that are told in all four Gospels. The betrayal by Judas, although John doesn't mention the kiss. But that made such an impact on the disciples. That action, that like Pearl Harbor, will live in infamy. And then all of them tell us about Peter's weaknesses, that he stood warming himself while his Lord stood shivering in front of his accusers because they'd taken off his outer garment. That he denied 3 times. That his first denial was to a servant girl. Really, Peter, a girl. And all four Gospels tell us that the cock crowed. The cock crows for us too. And all four Gospels tell us that the crowd shouted for Barabbas. And that shout has echoed down the century as the cry of a world rejecting the Christ. When he created us, he gave us a free will that we could choose to accept or reject him, and he's never withdrawn that free will. And here's the thing. Jesus knew how many would reject him, and yet he went through it all.
But he died, our Lord.